May I speak in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Please do be seated. It will not have escaped your notice that today is Easter Day, Easter Sunday, the morning of Easter Sunday. And Easter Sunday, I think, is not a day to pussyfoot around. This, of all days, is a day to reflect on life and on death. This, of all days, is a day to face big questions. A day to reflect on existence, on eternity, and above all, on God. So buckle in, get ready for the ride. We're going in. And let's start by diving in at the deep end. I wonder if you've ever touched a dead body. Let me tell you of my first experience of doing so, because for me, in terms of understanding today, this Easter story that we're reflecting on, for me it's helpful, and I hope it will be helpful for you. Over 4 decades ago, when I was 18 years old, I spent several months in Australia. For the first couple of months, I lived with a family in a rural area. The family had 5 children, the 4th of whom was a little girl called Alicia. Some of you who are regulars here at All Saints may recall me speaking about her before. Now, when I came to reside with the family, Alicia was seriously ill. She was ill with a terminal wasting disease. She was skeletal. She couldn't control anything of her body. The only way she could communicate was through her eyes. Now, because I was staying with the family and they were nursing Alicia at home, I joined in with caring for her, reading her stories, holding her hand, feeding her with a pipette. And through caring for Alicia, I came to love her. Not obviously like her family loved her, for they had known and loved her for the full 8 years of her life. And they'd known Alicia when she was well and happy, singing and dancing. They had a store full of memories. Well, I had only known Alicia when she was very sick and totally dependent on others. Well, several weeks later, after I'd been working with the family's 3 horses, the father found me some work on a friend's horse farm. It was challenging physical work in the Australian summer heat. One evening, after a long day, the owner came to me. "I have sad news, Alistair." I knew really what was coming. "I'm sorry to tell you that Alicia has just died." He continued, "The funeral will be next week, but don't worry, I will take you with me." Now, this was to be my first funeral as an adult. And much to my surprise, before the funeral service, it included an open casket containing Alicia's body inside the family home. I was invited to go in for a few minutes with Alicia's body. I held her hand, I touched her forehead. What was most striking was how cold she felt. But although the body was there, Alicia had gone. And I began to sob my eyes out. Why was I crying? Well, I think there were a host of things at play. I was away from my home country, And there in Australia, I had found a love that I had never known before. A love among the O'Brien family. Now, part of the love that I'd experienced was a love for Alicia, whom I'd only known as a fragile waif. Now, to add into the mix, I'd arrived in Australia as an ardent atheist. But the family were committed Catholics, convinced that God's love was real. Even, as it turned out, a love embracing them in the midst of the death of their beloved child. Now, my atheism, as you can imagine, was pretty deeply challenged by this experience. I left Australia not a Christian, but knowing that God was alive and that God was real. Because I'd met God among that family and in the face of Alicia's death. And in that moment, touching her cold body, it all proved too much for me. The tears flowed and flowed. Okay, well, let's turn and think about our gospel story. And as we do so, let's try to spot aspects of the story that we've maybe not noticed before. One thing to notice from Luke's account is that Peter disappears from the story on the Thursday night, after his third denial of Jesus. Luke reports that Peter went out and wept bitterly. Now, these were different tears to the tears I shed in Australia. These were tears of shame and recrimination. And according to Luke's careful evidence, there is nothing to indicate that Peter is present on the Friday. He doesn't appear in the story again until Sunday. Therefore, although Jesus' close acquaintances watched him being crucified, mostly from a distance, Peter perhaps doesn't. Peter doesn't watch Jesus die, an excruciating death on the cross. Just as I was away when Alicia died, it seems that Peter is away when Jesus dies. Peter is certainly not involved in touching Jesus' dead body, placing it in the tomb. That is done by a wealthy Jew who we hear is Joseph of Arimathea, probably assisted by his servants, as such a wealthy chap would be. Whilst Peter and all the other apostles are paralyzed and uninvolved. There is a big contrast here. Joanna and the women with her who followed Jesus are deeply present in the final hours. They mourn and lament as Jesus stumbles towards his place of execution. They watch as Jesus is nailed on the cross and dies on the cross. Joanna and these same women keep following. They watch while the rich man moves Jesus' body, places it in the fresh rock tomb. They take careful note so that when the enforced Sabbath is over, they can return to the right grave to anoint the right body. And so at the crack of dawn on the first day of the week, on the Sunday morning, here they are, ready and present. And it's Joanna probably who is the one who relays all this to Luke. However, they get there, and unlike my visit to the O'Briens' home, there is no open casket with a cold body in it. Instead, there is no body. The body has gone. And Joanna and the other women are at a complete loss. What has happened to it? Well, let's notice that although there is no body in the tomb, Jesus does not appear that Sunday morning. According to Luke, the very first appearance of Jesus is late on the Sunday afternoon, when a mysterious stranger falls in step alongside two bit-part disciples heading towards a little-known village called Emmaus. Next, let's notice that Joanna and the other women, they can't understand this on their own. They need a message from God to begin to make sense of what is happening. A message carried by two angelic figures. Now, did you spot that they don't have any wings? Only cherubim have wings, not angels. But they are, sorry, that spoils your party. But they are dressed in dazzling bright garments, just like Jesus at his transfiguration. And they don't come with a comforting message. They come with a tough one. It's not, yes, we know what you have been through, and we do understand why you are weeping and downcast. No, that's not what they get. Instead, it is, why do you look for the living among the dead? Whoa. Well, because he's dead, duh. Joanna and the women might be tempted to respond. We saw him die with our own eyes. We saw his body laid in the tomb. He is dead, dead, dead. What is it that you don't get? Now, Joanna and the other women resist all such temptations to respond in that way, probably because they are just plain too frightened to say anything at all. Then the messengers add two things. First, he's gone because he is risen. Well, we can see that he's gone, the women are thinking. But what does risen mean? The messengers clarify just a little bit. Remember what he told you over many months. That he'd be handed over to violent men and put to death, and on the third day that he would rise. Well, it does start to come flooding back for the women. Yes, that's indeed what Jesus used to say. But they hadn't understood it then, and they're not really sure what it means now. But if it is true, whatever it does mean, then they'd better hurry back and tell the others, tell the men. A little comment. It might be helpful to grasp that the contemporary Jewish understanding was this, that there would be a bodily resurrection of all the dead on the very last day, the great day of reckoning, but not before that. And Jesus' followers had also come across resuscitations. You'll remember the story of Lazarus. But no one in that era had any conception of a human being rising from death and living an ongoing life into eternity in a transformed body while the rest of life, or of mortal life, carried on. That just was not on anyone's radar. It was beyond everyone's comprehension. And so, to be charitable, it really isn't surprising that the men don't get it and can't believe the women. It is literally unbelievable. And then at this moment, Peter re-enters the story. Rather than just dismissing the unreliable female witnesses, Peter goes to check it out for himself. He finds the valuable grave clothes, which means that the body has not been stolen. For if they'd been grave robbers, that's what they'd have been after. That's what they'd have taken, the valuable grave clothes. And Peter finds that the women were truthful in at least one respect, at least. There is no cold body of Jesus. And so Peter's left to puzzle and wonder, what is going on? What if the women's report about divine messengers really is true? And what could it mean that Jesus is risen? Now, in Luke's account, that is where the story of Sunday morning ends. Luke holds us all in suspense. Where is Jesus' body? Luke does not reveal it yet. What does risen mean? Certainly those in the story get no answers yet. Let's notice also what is going on emotionally through this Sunday morning. Joanna and the other women are puzzled, utterly at a loss, as one translation puts it. And then next, they're terrified by the messengers in blazing garments. Then they are deeply frustrated, we must infer, because the men who are incredulous just don't believe the report of what they have seen and heard with their own eyes. And finally, we have Peter, who is amazed. Notice there are no praises and hallelujahs, no shouts of triumph or acclaim, no ringing bells, no victory hymns. Instead, what we have got this very first Easter Sunday morning is confusion, fear, bewilderment. I wonder where Easter Day 2022 finds you. After 2 years of a global pandemic in which friends or loved ones may have died and the world has been turned upside down, I would not be surprised if you're experiencing lingering confusion, fear, or bewilderment. And looking back to the first Easter Day morning, there were no easy answers, but there was a mysterious promise. He's risen. With the recent outbreak of a gruesome war on the continent of Europe and the accompanying threat of escalated violence, even the prospect of nuclear war, it is not surprising if you're experiencing some level of worry or bemusement. None of us expected to see this in our lifetimes. And certainly it's far worse the further east you go on the continent of Europe. And if you're living in the Donbass region, then life is hanging on by a thread and is for many truly unbearable. But even for us who are safely cushioned on the British Isles, these are anxious and bewildering times. The good news is that while we may not be sure what it really looks like, there is still a promise. He's risen. Let's look closer to home. Let's think about the parish of All Saints Highgate. 2 weeks ago, I offered a vision of what the future might conceivably look like for All Saints if we transported ourselves forward 8 years into the future. At least a couple of you said to me afterwards, "Alistair, that's a lovely vision. But how do we get from here to there?" It's really hard to conceive the journey. I certainly agree and know that it will not be straightforward, that there will be twists and turns along the way. And before I leave London, I hope to support Timothy and the Church Council in establishing a process of listening and discernment for you all, a process that might shine light on the next steps on the road ahead. Because even if we are not sure what it means, there is a promise for All Saints to hang on to today. He is risen. Now, on that first Easter day, the disciples, Joanna and all the other women, Peter and all the men, find themselves caught between two worlds. The worlds of their old understandings and their emerging discovery of a new world. One lived in the light of what they came to grasp was Jesus' resurrection. a new life beyond death. And as we've heard, by the time he reached Acts 10, Peter had got it all sorted out. He could give a coherent account of what the resurrection meant, what its significance was. But here in Luke 24, on that very first Easter Sunday morning, Peter is still puzzling it out, just as we are still puzzling it out. Peter was in an interim place, as we may be. Now, Sue and I are certainly familiar with this at present. Many of you will know we're in the process of moving house, moving out of London. Under English law, when you're selling and buying a house, once you've jumped the first hurdle of agreeing prices, there is a big hiatus. During this period, one's living with uncertainty as whether the two transactions, the sale and the purchase, will go ahead, and whether you'll be able to actually make the planned move. Until there is an exchange of contracts, there is no certainty, which means that one has to live each day, waking up in faith, trusting that the day will come when the move will happen, but unsure whether it ever actually will. Perhaps that captures something of where you may be at this morning, at least emotionally. It may be where this parish church is at today. I'm sure you will correct me if you see it differently. In the meantime, let's puzzle together over what it really means that he is risen. For the stone has been rolled away. The body is gone. God is up to more than we can ever fully imagine. But because Jesus is risen, whatever that means, we now know that we can never be separated from the extraordinary love of God. And so we need one another to work this out, to plumb the depths of the love that's deeper than any other love. A love, as I discovered among the O'Brien family, that cannot be bound by death. So let us remember all that God has shown us, all that the Spirit has spoken to us down the years, because Jesus is risen, and now he is here. He is here.